The gospel reading comes from the Gospel of Luke, the 17th chapter, 11 to 19. The healing of 10 lepers. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." As they went, they were made clean. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. Now he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus said, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to this foreigner, "Get up, go your way. Your faith has made you whole or well." Amen. This gospel reading, there are a few interesting things that it's worth noting. One is that there was a very harsh treatment of people that had leprosy, what we know of as Hansen's disease. But even backing up from that, one of the things Jesus was doing is he was walking between Jerusalem going up to Samaria. And he did that, or going up to Galilee. And in doing that, he passed through Samaria. Now, really good religious Jews at that time would take about a 20-mile, 15-mile detour by going around Samaria because they didn't want to contaminate themselves with those foreigners. And I don't know what they would have done at Walmart, having to go to Walmart, because there would have been people speaking Samaritan, I'm sure. And a good Jewish person, they not only wouldn't talk to Samaritans, they wouldn't even walk near them. So they would make a detour, they would cross the Jordan River, and on the other side of the Jordan River, they would walk up for a number of miles until they were around Samaria, and then they would cross back over into Galilee, thus remaining pure. And Jesus had the habit of just walking right through Samaria. And sometimes he stopped, and sometimes he ministered to people in the same way he ministered to the religious. So just to keep that in mind, Jesus was doing this. Samaritans were not Jewish people. They were people that had come in during the Babylonian conquest and had taken up a form of Judaism. So they were practicing an approximation of Judaism, which sort of intermingled also with their old religions. And although they worshipped in a similar way, they did it not in Jerusalem, but in one of the capital cities of Samaria. And maybe that is what made them even more despised by the Jewish people. So Samaritans were considered just dogs. They were even spoken of as dogs, as not worthy of being people. And Jesus was walking through Samaria, and right on the border of Samaria and Galilee, he was greeted by 10 lepers. Now, these lepers very likely had Hansen's disease. There would have been maybe a variety of skin ailments that could have been classed with leprosy. But most of these would have been Hansen's disease. It is not highly contagious. In fact, Hansen's disease is more passed through a susceptibility to certain people have more susceptibility with transferring it and being infected with it. Years ago, when Joy and I went to Brazil, one of the missionary medicine classes that we took was how to, out in the bush, recognize leprosy, because there still was leprosy in a number of countries. Here it had been pretty well wiped out. And the last of the people in Molokai, which was one of the few leper colonies in the United States, in Hawaii, that was winding down about the time we were in Brazil. But in Brazil and in other parts of South America and India, they still had leper colonies where people who had Hansen's disease lived. Oh, if I turn this on. Hansen's disease, one of the ways you can detect it is a person has a sore on their body, and it looks like a large infected sore. At least the edges of it are infected. It's larger and it just doesn't heal over. But one of the things is if you take a needle and you poke at it in the middle of that large sore, not at the very edges, but in the middle, there is no feeling. And so, thus, when someone has very advanced Hansen's disease, as this gentleman in this picture, you don't even feel with your fingers. So sometimes they get burned, sometimes they get infected, sometimes they are damaged as someone's trying to work. And sometimes those sores are on a person's face and very disfiguring. With the Jewish people, there were a couple of things about that. And if you get your mind on the disease, but then also on the fact that this disease was used as a picture illustration of sin. And maybe that's another whole sermon in itself, but it was a picture illustration of sin in our lives. Where when we first commit a sin, we're bothered by it. Our conscience is bothered by it. But the more we sin, the less we feel that prick and the pain of that. And it advances, and once it starts, it takes over. The Jewish leaders had in Jerusalem at the temple, noted in the Old Testament, they had a ritual that you could perform when a leper was cleansed or healed. So when a leper was healed, then he would go to the priests, offer a sacrifice, and there would be a time of containment, and they would look and see whether truly they had been healed. And they would have to proclaim this and then do a ritual. There was only one trouble. All the priests had memorized this rite of cleansing, but it never happened. There were only a couple times in history that we know of where some lepers had been cleansed. It was during the time of Elijah. And so that was big news in that country. And one of the signs that Messiah was coming was that lepers would be cleansed. And here at the temple, the priests, these are priests that are doing the sacrifice and in worship, but there were priests on hand for personal needs and for prayer. There were priests on hand to do that rite that they never had to do. So what does Jesus do? He has these 10 lepers approaching near the border with Samaria. Now, proper etiquette was that if you contracted Hansen's disease, if you contracted leprosy, and it was diagnosed, then you had to leave your home and live outside of the town. The person that had leprosy was incredibly vulnerable to attacks. They were living quite often in the open or in the tombs or in some shelter that the family provided, but outside of the walls, outside of that family protection. The families would bring them food, but a person that had leprosy would have to stand right about as far as Larry and Dave are back there at the sound booth. They would have to stand that far away from another person. So if someone brought them food, they would come, leave the food, they would step back, and when they had gotten about as far as I am from Larry, Larry could come up and take the food. And if they approached someone who was not infected by leprosy, one of the things they had to do was to cover their face. And many of them wanted to cover their face because of what they looked like. And they would shout out, so that you would not mistake that, they would shout out, "Unclean! Unclean! Unclean!" And believe you me, they could break up a crowd if they came walking close, shouting "unclean." But imagine what a boost that was to their self-esteem and morale. That no one would come near them or touch them. No one wanted to. People were afraid of them. Can you imagine what that was like? These 10 lepers followed Jesus, and they would have followed Jesus shouting. He was walking away from them, and as far as I am from Larry and Dave, they shouted out, "Son of David, have mercy on us." They wanted him to look at them. And here, the most repulsive people in that society, Jesus turned around and he said, he didn't even say, "Be healed." He said, "Go and show yourselves to the priest." Now, can you imagine? No one in hundreds of years had been healed of leprosy. If he had sent one person to the temple to be cleansed, all of Jerusalem would have been talking about it. Instead, he sends 10 time bombs to the temple. 10 of them in a group. And some of them weren't even Jewish. So that cleansing had to take place, not even in the holy place, very close to the altar where fewer people could go. But the priests had to go out into the common area where the crowds were and perform that cleansing ritual. It took days, actually, to do that. They had to do that in the open. They had to declare. In fact, these priests were declaring something very important, because one of the signs that Messiah had come was that the lepers would be cleansed. The deaf would hear, the poor would be preached to, the good news of Jesus Christ. So all of a sudden, 10 lepers show up at temple to obey the law. It said that they were not healed and then went. But as they started on their journey, they looked down at their hands, they looked at each other, and suddenly those sores were gone. I don't know exactly how that looked. Were some of what they'd lost restored? But certainly they understood that they were cleansed without any of those open sores anymore that they had suffered with, probably many of them, for years. One of them turned around and ran back to Jesus and fell at his feet. I think these men were stunned. They were just stunned by what had happened. 9 of them continued on, and one ran back and fell at Jesus' feet. I want you to understand this. He was supposed to stand as far off as I am from Larry until he was cleansed. He couldn't contain himself. You understand? This is Jesus. thing that can't be logic, but one that so commands the change in our lives, in our devotion to Him, that every bit of logic and training that this man had had to stay away from any other person, his mind just went awry. He ran to Jesus, fell at His feet, and thanked Him. And Jesus comments to His disciples, were there not 10 that were healed? And only one comes back, and guess what? He's a Samaritan. And He looked at this man who was now physically whole, and He said, your faith has saved you. Your faith has saved you. So beyond the physical healing, there was an inner wholeness, and that idea is wholeness. Healing was becoming complete again. So He said, outwardly He was healed. Now, inwardly, Jesus said, your faith has saved you. And He sent him on his way. Well, he probably turned around and ran after his companions as they walked towards Jerusalem to make a mess at the temple. Now, once again, standing at a distance, I think they had to relearn living, because God had made such a big, big change in their lives. Now, they arrived at the temple. We are not graced with the story of what happened when the religious leaders, who are trying to ignore the fact that Jesus is there, have to, in front of the people, do the sacrifice and the ritual and proclaim this person cleansed and healed of leprosy. Not only one, 10 times they had to do that. It was pretty amazing. And, as the story grew, I'm sure that many people showed up at the temple to see this rite that they had never seen done before. A couple of them weren't Jewish. It was done in a public place. It was done, I'm not sure exactly how it was done. I know the ritual, but I wonder how reluctant perhaps some of these religious leaders were to acknowledge that their world had been turned upside down. I want to just draw a couple lessons and understanding out of this. For one, God seems to enjoy upsetting the apple cart. My apple cart and your apple cart. I don't think He enjoys watching us suffer, but He's okay with upsetting the apple cart. Why? I think there are probably a number of reasons. But one of those, and there are lots and lots of ways for God to upset our apple cart. But it's interesting when those apples go rolling down the street, every which way, and we're suddenly diving for them and trying to pick them up, trying to put our pieces together. One of the things that we learn right away is that line that we have, that we live, guess who's in control? I'm in control. Excuse me, my generation used to read that. I'm in control, because I think God takes pleasure in saying, you think so? I don't think so. And He allows things into our lives. I don't think He always creates those, but He allows things in our lives which suddenly just upturn everything. And we have to acknowledge it. Am I in control? No, I'm not. God is in control. He hasn't moved. Now, I don't know how your last year has been, but if you feel like the apple cart's been upset more than once, even once, and you've been chasing apples down the street rather than being in control, you are not alone. And God takes pleasure in this, because one of the most important lessons we can learn in life is He is in control. I am not in control. And most of us, unfortunately, me included, need to be reminded and then re-reminded. Because maybe we go through a period where it seems like we got it all down. And God wants us to remember that throughout our whole life, we are dependent upon Him, and He needs to be in control. The other thing we take out of this is thanks to God. What pleased Jesus Christ was that one Samaritan who came running back, fell down at Jesus' feet. That he was either kneeling or maybe he even fell down and prostrated himself. Grabbing hold of Jesus' feet, he gave thanks to God. And there is a desire in God's part that we as Christians would give Him the deserved thanks, would in our hearts carry a whole message and outflow of thanks. You've all been there where you've seen a child or a grandchild who at his or her birthday or at Christmas opens presents and opens presents and opens presents. Oh, on to the next thing, on to the next thing. And maybe even at the end of getting 5, 6, 7 presents, I didn't get the electronic game I wanted. We've all been there? No? Yes? No? Well, if you've been in that place, you know how unlovely it is to have someone who's just demanding more and wanting more than they've got. It never stops and says, thank you. Thank you. You didn't have to. Thank you. Thank you. That's a beautiful thing. In fact, when you see that in a child, when you see a 6th, 7th, 8th grader write out a little thank you note, even if they're coerced, and they write out a little thank you note and send it to grandma, they send it to their teacher. Oh my goodness. Most of us as adults go, isn't that great? A spirit of thankfulness towards God is a healthy Christian expression. All of us need to practice it more. All of us need a refresher course time and again. So one of the things you take out of this is the joy that Jesus received at seeing someone thank Him. So, I leave. Pay attention. Pay attention to your apple cart. If it's turning upside down and suddenly you're chasing apples, rather than calmly walking down the street, likely God is knocking on the door, saying, Ray, John, Betty, attention please, Sam, all of us, pay attention to your apple cart. Is it getting shaky? Are you learning and relearning that He needs to be in control and He needs to be acknowledged that He is in control, I am not. Some of us tend to really need that illusion of being in control more than others, but all of us have issues with that. And then, pay attention to what and to how you pray, including thanksgiving, including, are we like that kid that just demands and demands and demands more? He tells us in Psalm 105, make your requests known. Every morning, make your requests known. He doesn't like the strong, silent type. He likes it when we make our requests known. But there's a big difference of making our requests known with thanksgiving and that kid who's never satisfied with what he got for his birthday or for Christmas. Pay attention. Pay attention to your apple cart. Pay attention to how you're praying. enjoyment of God. That one Samaritan who came back and just flung himself at Jesus' feet, forgetting all the protocol, and gave thanks, enjoying God's presence.